In fact, commentators are becoming more and more aware that there is a strong cosmic flavor to all of the instructions for the building of the tabernacle. It's basically, the tabernacle was like a shrunk down version of the whole of creation. So God has them build this tabernacle, this scaled down cosmos, and God did what? He did what with them there? He met with them there. He tabernacled with them there. The Shekinah glory of God dwelt there above the cherubim in the tabernacle. And it resulted in the nation of Israel having rest from their slavery. We see this pattern, secondly, in the temple. When we look at the temple and we look at the building of the temple, there's so much about that is a direct parallel to the pattern of creation. You recall in the building of the temple, in 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 1, now when the king, that is David, lived in his house, and the Lord had given him what? Rest. This is the passage I was referring to a while ago. From all his surrounding enemies, the king said to Nathan the prophet, see now I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent. What did David want to do? He wanted to build a temple for the Lord. He wanted to build a temple for the indwelling presence of God among his people there in Israel. But of course we know that God forbade David from building the temple because David was a man of war. He had shed much blood, but he did promise David that his son Solomon would be allowed to build a temple unto God there in Jerusalem. And we see in 1 Chronicles chapter 28 and verse 2, then King David rose to his feet and said, hear me, my brothers and my people, I had it in my heart to build what? A house of what? A house of rest. You see that motif lacing in and out of this temple idea here? The idea of God dwelling, of God meeting, of there being rest, God giving rest, God resting Himself. All of that is tightly woven into the concept of the temple here in the Old Testament. He said, I want to build the Lord a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord and for the footstool of our God. And I made preparations for building. Of course, Solomon, his son, winds up building it. But when we move on over to the history of Solomon, we see in 1 Kings chapter 4, and I know I'm moving through this quickly, but I'm bringing it to a point here. But now the Lord my God, Solomon says, has given me what? Rest. You see there again? God has given me rest on every side, and there's neither adversary nor misfortune. If you follow the narrative of the building of the temple in 1 Kings, in chapter 6 and verse 38, we find that it took Solomon 7 years to build the temple. How many days are included in the creation? 7. Solomon dedicated the temple. This is powerful here. Solomon dedicated the temple in the 7th month during the Feast of Tabernacles, which is a 7-day celebration. You see the parallels between creation and God dwelling and resting with His creation in the building of the temple. Solomon dedicated this temple and centered his dedication around 7 petitions or 7 prayers that he offered up to God. And when the temple was finished, all of these parallels between the temple and God creating the cosmos, when the temple is finished, look at this. Look at this. In Psalm 137 and verse 7, the people of Israel say, let us go up into God's tabernacle, God's dwelling place, and let us worship at His footstool. And this is a prayer that was common in Israel. Arise, O Lord, to your resting place. In Chronicles it says, you and the ark of your might. Or it says it here, actually, you and the ark of your strength. Let your priests be clothed with righteousness, and let your saints shout for joy. Do you see the relationship here with God and how it is centered around a temple, a dwelling place, rest, God resting, giving His people rest. The Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for what? His dwelling place. He dwelt in His creation in the beginning, and He's dwelling with His people in the temple here. This is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it. I will abundantly bless her provision. I will satisfy her poor with bread. I will also clothe her priests with salvation, and her saints shall shout for joy. You see that? Do you see that? Here you have God tabernacling with His people, presencing Himself with His people, satisfying their souls, causing them to rejoice, causing them to have great joy in the salvation that is theirs because God is dwelling with them. They are resting in God, and He is resting in His temple. The same thing that was happening all the way back there in Genesis chapter 2. So we also see, there's one other thing I want to point out here before we move on. But we also see when God is dwelling and sitting in the temple, this idea that God sits and He dwells in His temple that runs throughout the Old Testament. This is the sitting and the resting of a sovereign king who has conquered all, who has accomplished everything, and there's no threat, there's nothing to threaten Him. He is in charge. He is ruling over everything. That was a common pattern, a common motif among the Oriental kings that would conquer the then known world, that they would sit enthroned in their glory and there was nothing to threaten them. But the God who created the cosmos has chosen to sit and dwell among His people, unthreatened by anything, and to rest with His people and to give His people rest. Listen to the 99th Psalm, verse 1. The Lord reigns. You see, there's the idea laced in here too of the rule and the reign of God as well. The Lord reigns. Let the people tremble. He sits enthroned upon the cherubim. Remember, what did God do? He rested on the seventh day. He sits upon His throne in the cherubim. He is resting. He is accomplished. He is conquered. He is God. He is sovereign. He is King, dwelling among His people. He is enthroned upon the cherubim. Let the earth quake. The Lord is great in Zion. He is exalted over all the peoples. Let them praise Your great and awesome name. Holy is He. So we see the original creation, the tabernacle. This is your next bullet point. We see the original creation, the tabernacle, and the temple in Jerusalem all exhibit the divine pattern of, one, a finished work by God, a resting place where ruling sovereign God presences Himself with His people, resulting, number 3, in rest for the people of God. So we see this pattern in creation. We see it in the tabernacle. We see it in the temple. And as we come over into the New Testament, we see this pattern repeated yet once again in, guess what? The church. Remember our dealing with Christ's statement on the cross, "It is finished," last week in John chapter 19, verse 30. When Jesus had received the sour wine, He said, "It is finished," and He bowed His head and He gave up His spirit. Just as God perfectly completed and finished the work of creation, so Christ perfectly completed and finished the work of redemption. And all that was necessary for redemption was provided.